So far we've thought about disciplinarity and we've thought about temporalities, and this week we're turning to the idea of language. And as those of you who were here last week will remember, Adira Mangalagiri raised the kind of idea that reception, and perhaps, and now I'm speaking for her here, but perhaps particularly classical reception, tends to focus on the way it crosses temporal boundaries, while comparative literature often focuses more on crossing of linguistic boundaries. And so it's on that latter element that this week we're going to kind of home in on that idea and think about the question, what is a language, in all its range and all its possibilities. So it's a real pleasure to welcome our two speakers for this week, Dr. Lucy Jackson and Professor Matthew Reynolds. What I'll do, as in previous weeks, is introduce both speakers now so that they can speak one after the other, and we can just move on from one paper to the next before we have a short break and then return for the sort of discussion and questions. So our first speaker is Dr. Lucy Jackson. Lucy is an assistant professor in the Department of Classics and Ancient History at Durham University. Lucy's work focuses on ancient Greek drama in the 5th and the 4th century BCE, and particularly on the chorus. And in fact, her monograph entitled The Chorus of Drama in the 4th Century BCE was published by Oxford University Press in 2019. Lucy also works on the reception of Greek drama, and perhaps particularly in two different time periods. So on the 20th and the 21st century. And in that realm, she's also collaborated with the National Theatre here in London. And what we may or may not be going to hear about today is her work on the early modern period and the reception of Greek drama in the early modern period. Professor Matthew Reynolds, who's our second speaker today, is Professor of English and Comparative Criticism at the University of Oxford. Matthew has worked extensively on the way that literature crosses languages and on translation. And in a huge range of publications, I'll just mention a couple of them here. His co-edited volume that was published last year is entitled Creative Multilingualism, a Manifesto. And he's also written Translation, a very short introduction for the OUP series, and that was published in 2016. And also the Poetry of Translation from Chaucer and Petrarch, Homer and Logue that came out in 2011, as well as many others as well. So welcome both speakers and welcome everyone who is here today. As in previous weeks, the format is that each speaker will speak for about 15 minutes. And as I say, we'll hear one paper and then the next, and then we'll have about a 10-minute break, during which time, if you have questions, you can type them into the chat box. It's probably better not to type in questions while the speakers are speaking, because it can be a bit distracting for them as it comes through, but that 10-minute break is a good time to type in sort of short questions that we can come to after the break. Okay, so I think that's it from me, and I will hand over to Lucy at this stage.
The challenge of discussing what is a language in 15 minutes has been bracing, to say the least. I hope you will not think me foolhardy then if I attempt to discuss not one, but two possible languages today. The first, and I think this is what Fiona, Justine, and David had in mind when they invited me, is the language of Neo-Latin. There have been many English language introductions to and guides to Neo-Latin and its literature recently, and these are listed on your handout bibliography. And in all of these, one finds a helpful section addressing the question of what exactly Neo-Latin is. It proves to be a rather tricky task. They usually start by saying that Neo-Latin is a version of the Latin language that was written in and spoken roughly between 1300 and 1800 CE. Some note that it is characterized by a turning back towards classical models, or an attempt to stamp out the language of its medieval orthographies, words, constructions, and literary forms. And there are a couple of quotes listed under one on the handout. However, most experts in the field will concede, nay, will positively affirm, that when one takes into account the variety we might expect from a language that flourished for a millennium, there is nothing inherent in Neo-Latin to distinguish it from just plain Latin, other than its historical circumstances. Thinking back to last week to our discussion of temporality, when it comes to Neo-Latin, time both does and doesn't matter. Something that Neo-Latin experts would all agree on is that there is an utterly overwhelming amount of Neo-Latin material, most of which is unstudied or has not been studied with anything like the attention given to either classical Latin literature or to vernacular works written during the same period. To take one example, just for scale, 40 Latin dramas survive from antiquity, while between 5,000 and 10,000 plays were staged in Latin between the 15th and the 18th centuries. Jürgen Leonhardt speaks of Europe's collective amnesia when it comes to its post-classical Latin history. As my co-speaker very helpfully pointed out to me, the term Neo-Latin is itself a new one, and Neo-Latin studies is a relatively new discipline. And although there has been an immense energy within this discipline in attention in recent decades, there has been no significant paradigm shift. And there has certainly been no discipline within the discipline. And here I reference back to Emily's talk in week 1. In this respect, it strikes me how Neo-Latin studies is facing and wrestling with many similar questions and problems faced in comparative literature, world literature, and translation studies. An overwhelming amount of possible material, a seemingly impossible set of requirements in terms of expertise in classical Latin and literature, medieval and other post-classical forms and orthographies, a full range of vernacular languages around which Neo-Latinists, often thoroughly multilingual or plurilingual, were working, along with their relevant literatures. There is also a need for, although this need might be more clearly voiced than is often the case, a greater critical self-awareness within Neo-Latin studies. In a review of the status of the subject from 2001, the vast expanse of Neo-Latin material is referred to variously as terra incognita, terra nullius, and as a lost continent, terms that will quite rightly prompt more than one raise of an eyebrow among comparatists. Nowhere is this need for better critical frameworks more clear than in works where experts in, for example, translation studies and world literature include Neo-Latin in their discussions. Thomas Dinaire, Peter Burke, and R. Pochiessia, or the inclusion of Latin within Alex Beecroft's Ecology of World Literature. These works have drawn Neo-Latin into a broader conversation and demonstrated its singularities and its usefulness for honing the theoretical discussions and frameworks that have been and will continue to be discussed in seminar series such as this one. To take one example, I've found Neo-Latin useful for unpicking my assumptions about the primacy of national or native languages, used as it was as a world or cosmopolitan language for over a millennium, even though it was no one's mother tongue. I'm still pondering a provocation from Justine about how the Neo-Latin language might be subject to Barber's concept of mimicry. I'll leave these thoughts in the air for now. Now, for my second possible language, a more metaphorical take on the idea of language, but with concrete hermeneutic advantages. In my work on 16th century Neo-Latin drama, I've begun to explore how Greek tragedy itself, roughly defined as the 32 more or less extant tragic texts that survived from antiquity, might be treated as a language, and in particular, how the critical frameworks provided by translation studies might clarify the reception of Greek tragedy in the 16th century and beyond. I've been thinking about Greek tragedy as a language, less in terms of having its own syntax, grammar, features, and style, but more in its potential to be translated as a genre. Perhaps this might be one definition of a language, something to be translated. Thankfully, we can look forward to further discussion from Matthew on this point. The reason for offering this provocation of what we might consider a language comes from contemplating a particular question, an old one, thoroughly bound up in nationalistic politics, but one that has found new life in recent decades. Scholars have in the past expressed consternation at the strange relationship between Greek tragedy and Shakespearean drama. And here I refer to Michael Silk's chapter, also listed on the handout. In her excellent 2016 chapter, Claire Kenwood outlines the three approaches taken in recent years. First, either acknowledging the strange affinity but denying direct contact between Shakespeare and Greek tragedy. Second, looking to the close Latin and vernacular translations of Greek texts that were widely available from the beginning of the century by authors such as Erasmus, Buchanan, etc. So these are works by Louise Schleiner, Sarah Dewar Watson, and particular Tanya Pollard. And a third approach taken by Ingustina Eubank, which is somewhere in the middle, allowing for suffuse, indirect, or subterranean influences. I began my work firmly located in the second of these approaches, but have found greater potential and possibility in the third. Let us turn to an example. In the late 1530s and early 1540s, a Scotsman of modest means, George Buchanan, was teaching at a school in Bordeaux. This was the same Buchanan who, by the end of the 16th century, would have gained a reputation as one of Europe's foremost intellects, exerting influence within the so-called Sydney Circle in England, the Pléiade in France, whose works would be republished in hundreds of editions within decades of his death. But before all of this, he was toiling away, teaching the boys of Bordeaux, among them Michel Montaigne, Latin and Greek. On top of his arduous teaching duties, and it seems only shortly after turning up for his teaching post in the late 1530s, he was also tasked with writing and producing plays in Latin for his pupils to perform. He says that in his very relatable panic, he reached for an exercise he had been doing to improve his Greek, a translation into Latin of Euripides' Medea, later published in 1544. Buchanan would go on to produce 3 further plays in Latin, another declared translation, Euripides' Alcestis, and 2 original Latin plays with plots taken from the Bible, Jephthah's Sive Wotum and Baptiste's Sive Calumnia. Buchanan cut his playwriting teeth translating Greek tragedy. It is no surprise then that Buchanan's original dramas transmit or translate the language of Greek tragedy into the new language of Neo-Latin and into what Buchanan himself wanted to be a new kind of drama. Textual parallels and linguistic echoes have been carefully noted alongside the allusions to Seneca, Ovid, and a host of other Latin authors in whose texts Buchanan was steeped. But what hadn't been noted, but what became apparent to me as I read one of these plays, the Baptistes, was a more diffuse kind of translation of Greek tragedy. The Baptistes gives an account of the last days of John the Baptist and his decapitation at the behest of Herod's daughter-in-law. And while we might expect, and scholars have looked for, plenty of Euripidean echoes, what actually emerges is a translation of key elements from a play of Sophocles, his Antigone. The clearest of these translations is found when John the Baptist appears for the last time on stage before his death, heading towards prison and bidding a farewell to his concerned and gathered friends. There are remarkable coincidences of scene structure and imagery with Antigone's final appearance in Sophocles' play. She too acknowledges her imminent death and bids farewell to the concerned chorus. However, Antigone's famous mournful farewell to the sun before being buried alive in a rocky prison was translated and reconfigured into a more triumphant and glorious exit for John the Baptist, bidding a happy farewell to his corporeal prison and looking forward to seeing the true sun and light of God in the afterlife. Buchanan's translation of the Sophoclean scene blends pagan Greek with Christian Latin drama, but it also highlights a clash of cultures. In contrast to the Christian male Baptist, pagan female Antigone gets her eschatology all wrong. And in making this translation, Buchanan steers his 16th century readers towards a negative appraisal of Sophocles' heroine. She is developed through the act of her translation into an anti-John the Baptist. There are other scenes in the Baptistes that bear signs of a translation of Sophocles' Antigone. Both plays open with dialogue between an enraged and impassioned speaker and a more moderate interlocutor. Discussions of tyranny and the competing claims of mortal and divine law pop up throughout the biblical drama. But what is absolutely clear from Buchanan's translation is how the recasting of the figure of Antigone into the culture of Neo-Latin drama in 16th century Europe reorientates the audience towards the ethics and personae of Sophocles' play. Buchanan was far from unusual in looking to translating Greek tragedy as a means of improving his ancient Greek. This seems to have been a common practice in the early 16th century across Europe. Might not other dramatists writing original Latin plays during this period be performing similar acts of translation at whatever level of consciousness? It is at this point that I want to turn to a metaphor for translation suggested and discussed in Matthew Reynolds' recent edited volume, that of prismatic translation. Challenging the seemingly inescapable linearity of translation metaphors from Venuti onwards, Reynolds suggests that we critique the image of a channel and shake off the idea of translation as a single text translated by one person into another thing, saying that we should pluralize. In doing so, translation's dominant metaphor would change. It would no longer be a channel between one language and another, but rather a prism. It would be seen as opening up the plural signifying potential of the source text and spreading it into multiple versions, each continuous with the source, though different from it. And that's a quotation that you'll find on your handout. There is for me an immediate attraction of the prism metaphor for translation, particularly looking at the unclear, or perhaps we might say dazzling, vista of Greek tragedy's reception in the 16th century. The breaking up of different parts of Greek tragedy's language, refracting it through the process of prismatic translation, explains why that process and its outcomes are not and have not been immediately visible to the naked scholarly eye. Various elements of Greek tragedy might be taken up, refracted into an initially unrecognizable part or reconfigured element, yet carry with it the potential for reconstitution and retranslation when it comes into contact with the next or another prism, refocused along with other elements to produce something that is a bit like Greek tragedy, but different. As Reynolds notes, the process of prismatic translation can work in two directions. Quote, much varied textuality flows into the moment of translation, just as much varied textuality can emanate from it. There are prisms angled in both directions. Later in the 16th century, Thomas Watson produced a more obviously close translation of Sophocles' Antigone, published in 1581. This was the first published translation of a Greek tragedy by an Englishman and an influential work in its own right. Watson very likely knew of Buchanan's works and had read his plays. So we might not be surprised to see Watson's orientation towards the central figure of Antigone as markedly negative in orientation, a focalizing of the figure of the defiant young female as refracted through the figure of John the Baptist. Layered on top of this, we can note Neo-Latin's capacity to open up potential associations with a range of cultural, religious, or political arenas. These multiple associations allow for a highly labile orientation on the part of 16th century readers towards Greek tragedy, allowing them to access and interpret its language from multiple perspectives: pagan, Christian, Catholic, Protestant, antique, and modern. Whether the notion of Greek tragedy as a language is something that has critical use or not, translation studies approach to language, defining its contours and enriching our appreciation for how translation works, is, I hope, of obvious inspiration and use. I hope the discussion here today continues to provoke my own and others' thinking on this question. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Lucy. Much for us to think of there, but we will hand right over to Matthew and get our thoughts together after that.
Great, thank you. Hi, everyone. It's really lovely to be here joining in this really interesting series of discussions, and also to be following that great paper from Lucy. And it's been really interesting already to discover the kind of intersections between our work already and the little kind of email exchange that we had in the run up to this session. Okay. And what I'm going to say will connect a little bit to what Lucy's been saying already. So it occurs to me that the question we've been set for this week is one of those modern style of exam questions that we heard about last week from Tim Rood, the idea of which was that they would help usher in, if I remember right, the genius that is coming to be, in the words of R.W. Livingston, which is quite a task. But I guess we can, I don't know, who knows what might happen. We can hope. I'm not going to answer the question though. And the reason is that I think it cannot be answered. So thanks for that, Fiona, Justine, and David. But I'm going to suggest that it's important we keep this lacuna in mind, this impossibility of defining a language in our work, which, whether we're comparatists or receptionists, we might casually think of as happening across languages. If we can't define a language, how can we be working across languages? So I'm going to offer some remarks about how language difference figures in comparative and world literary studies and translation studies. Say something about how I think it ought to figure, and then gesture to possible points of overlap with classical reception studies. There'll be some connection to the discussion of translation that happened last week and the week before, as well as to what Lucy's just been saying. And also I think of what I'm going to say as having some relevance to the question of what our own professional communicative practices should be like, including our writing practices. So this is a hook back to something that came up in the first seminar, especially in the talk by Emily Greenwood. What kind of language should we be using? And I'm not going to say anything explicitly about that in the remarks I've prepared because there isn't time, but I'm happy to try to in discussion if anyone would like. So why is it impossible to answer the question, what is a language? To show this, I'm just going to quote various authorities. And all the references and quotes are in that handout, which I hope is in the chat. First, the linguist Torre Jansen, in his really excellent short rumination on the history of language and languages called Speak. Jansen observes, there are few generally accepted rules or criteria for deciding when two ways of speaking should be regarded as being the same language and when they should be seen as two separate ones. But as the discussion advances, this is revealed to be a grave understatement or overstatement, I can't decide which it is, since it turns out there are in fact no such generally accepted rules or criteria. Jansen points, for instance, to Swedes and Norwegians, who can often understand each other perfectly well, even though they're supposed to be speaking different languages. And on the other hand, he points to some Americans from the Midwest who apparently cannot understand some Londoners, even though they're supposed to be speaking the same language. But the examples don't matter because I'm sure, you know, all of us can think of similar instances in many different locations of continuities across what might be thought of as being different languages or what are commonly thought of as being different languages, and differences within of as being one language, and indeed cases where it's not clear which possible language name we might best apply to the way of speaking that's being used. Jansen himself thinks the best way forward through this mess really is to adopt speakers' own ideas of which language they think they're using. And he pursues this gambit in various interesting directions, but it is fraught with problems, as Jansen himself recognizes, and in ways which I imagine will be pretty obvious to most people listening. One such problem is that people's ideas of what they're doing in language, and indeed their language practices themselves, have often been imposed on them imperialistically or by related kinds of political or indeed educational coercion. Here I'm thinking, for example, of the essay by Robert Young, which is on the handout, in which he argues that the idea of a language as a discrete entity was a concept devised by European philologists, and gives the telling example of G.A. Grierson, a philologist and civil servant who was tasked with producing a linguistic survey of India at the turn of the 19th and 20th centuries. Awkwardly for him, Grierson discovered that many colonial subjects in India did not think of themselves as speaking separate languages, but rather as participating in something more like a dialect continuum. And as he wrote, as Young quotes, it thus follows that while the dialect names in the following pages have been taken from the indigenous nomenclature, nearly all the language names have had to be invented by Europeans. Like many such organs of linguistic definition and discipline, including dictionaries and grammar books, the Linguistic Survey of India was, of course, produced in writing and then print. And I'm going to quote Alistair Pennycook on the loss entailed that process. The codification of languages is not so much a process of writing down what already exists, as it is a process of reducing languages to writing. This means that there is always and everywhere a yawning, indeed unbridgeable gap between languages as they are recorded and known, and the actual language use of people to whom the codified languages are attributed. It follows that, in Pennycook's words, the notion of a language does not refer to any real object. However, what are very much verifiable, and do have real existence, as Pennycook cautions, are the effects of repeated construction and reconstruction of the idea of there being such a thing as a language. These inventions have a reality for the people who deal with them, he says. They have reality, for instance, for anyone told by state powers that their does not correspond to the correct language and that they ought to change it. And of course, varying degrees and kinds of violence can attach to that exhortation. Now, this critique of the concept of a language, of course, sits rather awkwardly in relation to the traditional and widespread view that comparative literature works across languages, and indeed to a view of translation as bridging the difference between languages. My own view, in which I'm indebted in particular to the couple of books on the handout by Naoki Sakai and Lydia Liu, is that we need to realize that translation participates in the regulation of differences in language, including in the creation of differences between what then come to be accepted as different languages. That is, it participates in the creation of and regulation of the very differences which we might naively have been invented to overcome. So it's not that first there are separate languages and then translation comes along, communication to happen between them. Rather, there is first an undefined continuum of language difference, and translation collaborates with the processes of standardization and codification by which this continuum is separated out in called languages that can be regulated and aligned. And as this happens, you can then start to have a concept of equivalence, which you can't have outside this process, I think. And this idea has connection, as you can see, to the material Lucy's been discussing and some of the points she made about it. My favorite illustration of the point is from Dickens's Oliver Twist. And here on the handout, we have one of Fagin's boys, Charlie Bates, who's chatting to the Artful Dodger, Oliver. And Charlie says, "What a pity it is he isn't a prig." At which the Artful Dodger turns to Oliver and says, "I suppose you don't even know what a prig is." And Oliver replies, "I think I know that. It's you're one, are you not?" inquired Oliver, checking himself. So why doesn't Oliver go through with the translation here? Yeah. Why doesn't he say, "I know that prig means thief"? Because if he did so, he'd be defining and asserting a difference of language and therefore a difference of group identity between himself and the Artful Dodger and Charlie. In the language of Fagin's boys, a prig is a glorious hero, but it's equivalent, and here we see something interesting about the functioning of the idea of equivalence. It's equivalent in Oliver's language. Thief is someone who's termed imprisonment, and Oliver does not yet want to situate himself as someone who speaks that different language. In my view, translation always begins with this kind of moment. And translation studies should likewise start by asking how translation is participating in the organization and definition of language difference, rather than by assuming the pre-existence of separate languages. And comparative literature, likewise, I think, needs to start from an awareness of the great variety of locations, so not just between standard languages, but the great variety of locations in which language difference can rise up and assert itself. Now, in saying this, I'm really just reiterating Gayatri Chakraborty Spivak's call from back in 1993 in Death of a Discipline for a kind of language training that's not wholly dedicated to achieving fluency in standardized language, but which rather discloses the irreducible hybridity of all languages. But I'm reiterating it really with added urgency, an added urgency that comes from the continuing and widespread lack of attention to language difference in much of the by now well-established field of world literary studies. As Mary-Louise Pratt said, astonishing as it may seem, language has not been a category of analysis in the now vast academic literature on globalization. Those words are from a decade ago now, but I think they still hold pretty much true today. Of course, there are exceptions, and one brilliant exception has been the Multilingual Locals and Significant Geographies project run by Francesca Orsini with Karima Lahir and Sara Matsugora. Focusing on North India, the Maghreb and the Horn of Africa, their research has explored, among other things, the literary practices and dynamics with multilingual regional societies, taking these as the starting point for a theorization of literature as inhabiting not simply the world, so it's not world literature because it's in the world, but rather as inhabiting some of the many overlapping and intersecting significant geographies, as they call them, of which the world is made up. The major achievement of this research is that it creates a frame for understanding non-Western literatures from the ground up, as they say, as Orsini, Matsugora and Lahir say, rather than by importing Western categories such as those of the standard language and the national literature. But there's a byproduct for which I'm personally grateful, since my expertise is located parochial in Europe, which is that it also offers fresh and better ways of thinking about the workings of translation and European literature. It allows us to see Oliver Twist, for instance, not as a novel written in English, but rather as the work of a multilingual local deploying an internally fractured linguistic repertoire in which different significant geographies overlap and clash. Or take as another too swift example, an even more canonical figure, Dante, and the encounter with Virgil in Canto 1 of the Inferno, Nacqui sub Iulio ancor che fosse tardi, and so on, that speech. So this is Virgil speaking, part of a conversation blending language, which we might now separate out and label Latin and Italian, but which for Dante was part of a linguistic complex which he defined in quite different terms. In this moment, we have not only a foundational instance of classical, but I can now see an encounter between two multilingual locals, attentive to the gestures, guesses, and partially shared points of reference, by which an understanding can be patched together through language difference, rather than between languages. And this brings me to my guess about synergies between classical reception studies and a multilingual local style approach to comparative and world literature. In my moments of moonlighting in classical reception, my impression has been that since it works across a great spread of linguistic continuity and difference through time, and since it links and spans national traditions, and both of these, we have instances of both of these in Lucy's talk, obviously, because of this kind of breadth, it can foster an attention to the complex workings of language variety, which I've been trying to, and thereby, I hope, help energize a new translation studies, which sees translation as happening not between different languages, but through language difference, and a new comparative world literary studies, which begins not from languages plural, but from the plurality of all language. Great, thank you.